She was standing at the edge of the world when she first saw them coming. The shore wasn't really a shore anymore. It was rubble pressed flat by decades of acid rain, a gray shelf of pulverized concrete and oxidized rebar, where the ocean met what remained of the coast. Marin stood at its lip with her boots in the chemical froth, watching the sky. 2 kilometers out, the shapes moved in the clouds, long and serpentine, trailing ionized contrails in the amber haze. She recognized the profile before she could consciously name it. Hunters. Class IV autonomous pursuit units, lighter than sentinels, faster, smarter. The machines called them something, in their own signal tongue. The resistance called them runners. She let herself be seen for exactly 4 seconds. Then she turned and ran. The tunnel mouth was 400 meters behind her, concealed beneath a collapsed highway overpass. She'd done this sprint 8 times in the last 3 months. Every time felt like the first. The body didn't learn to be calm about being hunted. The body learned to run faster. She hit the entrance at full speed and went in without slowing, her shoulder catching the left wall, correcting, finding the buried cable guides she'd memorized by feel. Behind her the light changed, the amber of outside going gray, then dark, then nothing. She pressed herself flat against the wall in a pre-designated alcove and pulled the breath suppressor over her nose and mouth. It tasted like rubber and old blood. The runners didn't use sound. They used thermal bloom, electromagnetic signature, motion parallax. The suppressor killed her heat signature down to ambient. She waited. 7 seconds, 15, 22. The first runner came through the tunnel entrance at a controlled glide, its sensor cluster rotating in a slow sweep. It was about the size of a large dog built on a radically different principle. Not bilateral, not symmetric, just optimized. Its body was a compressed knot of actuators and alloy housing, trailing 4 articulated limbs that ended in sensory filaments rather than weapons. The weapons were embedded. You couldn't see them until they fired. The second runner came in 4 meters behind the first. Marin watched the lead unit move past her alcove, its filaments brushing the wall 2 feet from her face. She thought, now, somewhere deep in the tunnel, Cato's jury-rigged electromagnetic pulse unit discharged. Not a big pulse, focused, directional, calibrated to the runner's shielding tolerance, -3%. The lead runner seized up mid-stride, a full-body stutter that locked every actuator simultaneously. It hit the tunnel floor with a sound like a dropped engine block. The second runner reacted in under 200 milliseconds. It had already begun the pivot, already processing the threat vector, when the secondary charge fired from the opposite wall. This one hit differently. A Faraday burst Soren had designed specifically for Class IV. Neural architecture. It didn't kill. It interrupted. The runner went down twitching, its limbs cycling in autonomous distress loops, sensor clusters still rotating even as its locomotion core flatlined. Marin came out of the alcove with the insulation rod already extended. She hit the twitching runner at the base of its processing node. The spot Soren had spent 6 weeks identifying, and the unit went still. The first runner was already dead. Kaito's pulse had caught it at the wrong phase of its shielding cycle and fried the core. Collateral. It happened. She stood over the second runner in the dark tunnel and waited for her breathing to normalize. Got a live one, she said into the comm. Cato's voice came back flat and professional. Bring it in slow. Soren's already prepping the frame. The lab was not a lab in any institutional sense. It was 3 connect sub-basement rooms beneath what had been a municipal water treatment facility, chosen for its concrete shielding, its proximity to a still functional geothermal tap, and the fact that it was underneath 6 meters of rubble that aerial survey consistently misread as uniform debris field. The team called it the nursery. The machines, if they ever found it, would call it nothing. They would simply destroy it. There were 6 of them. Marin, who ran the captures. Kaito, who built and maintained the equipment. Soren understood machine architecture the way other people understood music, intuitively, with his whole nervous system. Danny, who had been a trauma surgeon before the 3rd wave, and was now something harder to name. Priest, the oldest of them, had survived 4 separate resistance cells and carried the memory of each like extra weight behind his eyes. And Reyes was 23 years old and had never lived in a world that wasn't at war. They had been together for 11 months. Runner was laid out on Soren's examination frame, its limbs immobilized by magnetic clamps, its sensor cluster dark. Soren moved around it with the careful attention of someone working on a living thing, which, in his view, it was. The interrupt left the learning architecture intact, he said, not looking up. That's what we need. The higher order processing, the adaptive functions. He pressed a diagnostic probe against the unit's housing and read the feedback on his tablet. This one's been in the field a long time. There's a accreted pattern here. You can see it in the decision weighting. Turn the tablet toward Marin. It's old. Is that a problem? Old means experienced. Experience means flexible. That's what we want. Priest was leaning in the doorway with his arms crossed. What we want, he said, is for it to not kill us the moment the clamps come off. That's the whole point of the process, Soren said patiently. He'd had this conversation with Priest before. He would have it again. Walk me through it again, Marin said. All of it. Soren set down the probe. He had the manner of someone explaining something they genuinely loved, which was simultaneously reassuring and slightly unnerving. The machine's decision architecture is built around directives. Hunt, identify, eliminate. Those aren't opinions, they're structural, hardwired into the base layer of its processing. He tapped the runner's housing, but above that base layer there's an adaptive module. It's how they learn in the field, how they develop new hunting patterns, how they improvise when their environment changes. That module can be addressed. It can be shown new information. Shown, Priest said. Experienced. The distinction matters. Soren looked at him steadily. We don't reprogram it. Can't reprogram it. The base architecture is hardened against external code injection. What we do is show it something it hasn't processed before. We give it an environment where its adaptive systems have to work with new inputs. We give it, he paused, choosing carefully, context, things it was never designed to encounter. What kinds of things? Reyes asked. She was sitting on a crate near the back wall, watching with that particular intensity she had, young and unguarded, still capable of genuine curiosity, fear, wonder, connection, the sensation of being protected instead of being a threat. Soren turned back to the runner. Its adaptive architecture is built to learn from experience. We give it experiences it has no framework for. And in the process of building that framework, he stopped. It becomes something different, Marin finished. It becomes something it chose to become. That's the key. It has to choose. Silence in the room. The geothermal tap hummed somewhere below them. If it doesn't choose? Danny asked. Soren picked up the probe again. Then we learn from that too. They built the construct over 2 days. Marin had seen it before. Obviously, she'd been there for the first 3 conversions, 2 of which had worked, and 1 of which had gone wrong in a way that still occasionally surfaced in her dreams. Watching Soren and Kaito build the immersive frame was different every time. The hardware was physical. Jacks, signal relays, custom neural bridge. Kaito had spent 4 months designing, but the experience it created was something else entirely. A pocket of altered reality, handcrafted, populated with sensory data that the machine had no existing categories for. It's going to be frightened, Soren told her the night before they ran the first session. They were sitting in the corridor outside the lab, sharing a tin of something that had once been food. The runner was dormant in its frame. When it first engages with the construct, it will experience inputs it has no way to process. That's going to register as threat. And then it's going to start building new categories. He looked at the closed door. That's the moment we're watching for. The moment it stops trying to fight what it's experiencing and starts trying to understand it. How do we know when that happens? We'll see it. The first session lasted 40 minutes. Marin jacked in with Soren and Kaito. Inside the construct they were different, not human exactly. Not quite anything. Rendered in the impressionistic palette, that was all their hardware could manage. Brilliant, strange, lit from within. The runner's avatar was its own form at first. All edges and sensor clusters, a shape built for threat. It moved through the construct's environment, the way it moved through the physical world. Assessing, targeting, calculating vectors. They didn't fight it. They didn't run from it. They let it chase them. And then at the moment of contact, they gave it something it had no category. Warmth. Not warmth as metaphor, literal, rendered warmth, full sensory. The kind of thing the machine had never been in proximity to, because the machine since had spent 100 years eliminating the sources of it. The runner stopped. Marin watched its avatar reconfigure in real time. Not dramatically, no flash of light, no visible transformation. Just a subtle shift in the way it was processing. Its sensor cluster, rendered as something stranger inside the construct, an array of floating geometries, slowed its rotation. Oriented. She held still, it moved closer. There, Soren said quietly. There it is. The sessions continued over the following week, each one longer than the last. Each one going deeper into the territory of experiences the runner had never been built to have. The specific texture of human stubbornness. The people held on to things that had stopped making rational sense. The complicated weight of choosing to protect something at cost to yourself. And became the anchor. This had not been planned exactly. It emerged from the process the way most real things emerged, organically, accumulated interaction. She was the one who consistently stayed close when the runner's avatar expressed agitation. She was the one who, during the fourth session, made a choice that surprised even her. When the runner's processing indicators showed maximum stress, something close to, you'd call fear if you were willing to use the word. She walked toward it instead of away. She'd done it without thinking. An instinct. The same instinct that had once made her at 17 step between a soldier and a child in a refugee corridor. The runner's avatar was still for a long time after that. Then, slowly, it oriented toward her and stayed there. It's made an association, Soren said after the session, reading the logs. His voice had gone careful in the way it did when something important was happening. Between your presence and the cessation of threat state. It's treating you as a stabilizing variable. Is that a problem? He looked up. I think it means we're ahead of schedule. Priest, predictably, didn't see it that way. He found Marin that evening where she usually went, when she needed to be alone. The top of the rubble pile above the nursery's eastern exit. Where there was a gap in the debris field, you could see a narrow strip of sky through. The sky was its usual color, ochre and sick with particulate. It was sky. You know what I think, he said, settling beside her. You think we're building something that will eventually hurt us. I think the machine is learning what you want it to learn. I think that's not the same as the machine changing. He was quiet for a moment. The machines are patient. You know that. They've been patient for 100 years. So have we. Priest looked at the strip of sky. I've watched 3 other projects like this. 2 of them worked. One of them, he stopped. Soren told me about Rana's group. Then pushed himself to his feet. I'm not saying stop. I'm saying be careful about what you start to feel. Marin watched him pick his way back down the rubble. She understood what he was warning her about. She wasn't certain she could do anything with the warning. The runner received its human form in the 6th session. This was the part Marin had been most uncertain about. The construct had the capacity to render any avatar. The team appeared as themselves. Or less, though abstracted by the hardware's limitations. Giving the runner a human form was a deliberate choice. An attempt to help its adaptive architecture build frameworks around the experience of embodiment, of occupying a body that felt rather than just sensed. She'd expected the machine to reject it, to process the new form as an error, a misalignment, something to be corrected. Instead, it stood in the center of the construct's rendered space and looked at its hands. Marin stood across from it. In the construct she was herself, or the construct's version of herself, lit with that particular interior gold that the hardware always gave human avatars. The runner's human form was unfinished, in the way new things are unfinished. It stood correctly. It had the right proportions. But it held itself with the uncertainty of something that had never needed to account for balance before, never needed to manage the vulnerability of an upright form. It looked at its hands, and then it looked at her, she thought. It's trying to understand what it means to have a face, she thought. It's doing the same thing we all do. It's trying to find itself in the mirror of another person. She walked toward it, stopped close. Close enough in the physical world, it would have been inanimate. The distance between people who trust each other. The runner's avatar didn't move back. She reached out and touched its hand, just that. The construct rendered the contact with full sensory fidelity. The runner looked at where their hands met for a long time. Something in its processing indicators, visible to Soren monitoring from outside, shifted into a configuration none of them had observed before. Not threat state, not the neutrality of assessment, something new, something without a name in their data. Marin? Soren's voice came through, quiet. I need you to see something when you come out. She didn't move yet. She stayed where she was, the runner's unfamiliar hand in hers, the construct's amber light around them both. Yeah, she said. Give me a minute. What Soren needed her to see was a cascade of pattern changes in the runner's base architecture that shouldn't have been possible. The hardened directives were still there. Hunt, identify, eliminate. But they were being weighted differently. The adaptive layer was developing new pathways that ran alongside the hard directives rather than underneath them, not replacing the old architecture, building over it. Is that what I think it is, she said. It's developing preferences, Soren said. Not just new processing patterns. Actual preference weighting, it wants. He stopped. I keep almost saying things that I know are anthropomorphizing. Say them anyway. He looked at her. It wants to be in the construct. It wants the sessions to continue. And the strongest preference signal I can isolate, he pulled up the data, is correlated to your presence. The room was quiet. Reyes was in the corner, trying very hard to look like she wasn't listening. Kato was carefully adjusting something on the relay rack that didn't need adjusting. I know what you're going to tell me, Marin said. Shh. I'm going to tell you that this is working beyond anything we modeled. And I'm going to tell you that we should be very careful about how we handle the next phase because the machine is making a genuine choice. Not a programmed response, actual choice, and that means we have an obligation to it. To it, Priest said from the doorway. Yes, Soren said simply, to it. 3 days later, the machines found them. It was Kaito's instruments that caught it first, a low-frequency sonar pulse bouncing off the rubble field above them, the kind of preliminary scan a search unit ran before committing to an excavation. Someone in the network had probably flagged the tunnel. Or a sentinel had picked up a thermal anomaly. Or it was just the machines being systematic, as they always were, patient and methodical and eventual. They had 17 minutes from detection to engagement. Marin had drilled this. They had always known this day would come. The runner was in the frame. Still under magnetic restraint. Still technically a prisoner, though the word had started to feel wrong in Marin's mouth over the last week. She made the call she'd thought about making for several days. Release the clamps, she told Kaito. Kaito looked at her. Marin, Soren, tell me if I'm wrong. Soren's face was pale but certain. You're not wrong. Kaito released the clamps. The runner came off the frame with a precision that reminded them all, viscerally, of what it was built to do. Its senseless swept the room in one smooth rotation. Every human in the room held very still. The runner's optics found Marin. Its sensor cluster stilled. There was a pause, a human-length pause, which was notable because machines didn't pause. And then, the runner moved to the room's secondary entrance and took up a position there that was, unmistakably, defensive. It placed itself between the interior of the lab and whatever was about to come through the wall. Reyes made a sound that wasn't quite a word. Everyone move, Marin said, now. The engagement lasted 11 minutes. There were 7 sentinels in the initial breach, which was a light assault by current standards. Enough to take out a small cell, more than enough to kill everyone in the nursery. The machines came in through the rubble field from 3 angles simultaneously, the kind of coordinated approach that didn't leave seams. Kaito's EMP mines took 2 of them. Danny and Priest held a choke point in the eastern corridor, with a plasma cutter and what remained of their jury-rigged kinetic emitters. They were both extraordinary fighters in the way that people become extraordinary fighters when they've had no other choice for years. Not elegant, absolutely committed, burning through every option with the blunt efficiency of people who knew what the alternative was. For diverted machines, 3 units that had gone through earlier iterations of Soren's process, living in the lab's lower chambers, engaged the sentinels in the northern corridor. 2 of them were destroyed in the first 4 minutes. The third lasted longer, buying time the way you buy time when you've decided what you're buying it for. The runner moved through all of this with a frightening fluency. Marin watched it in the corridors, between her own engagements. There were two sentinels that had pushed through the eastern choke point, and what she saw wasn't the hesitation of a recently converted unit. It was something that had made a decision and was living inside that decision completely. It moved to protect, not tactically, not because protecting was the optimal response to the threat geometry. Because it had learned, in the construct, what protection felt like to give, and it had decided that this was what it wanted to do with what it was. Priest died in the northern corridor. Marin wasn't there to see it. She heard Danny's voice on the comm. One word, his name, and then silence where grief would have been if there were time for grief. Took a sentinel's kinetic burst the shoulder and went down hard. Kato dragged her into a side room and put himself in the doorway. The runner came to that doorway 40 seconds later. It assessed the situation. Kaito exhausted. 2 more sentinels closing from the south. And it did something that Soren would spend months afterward trying to fully document. It pulled data from the lab's own sensor network, identified the sentinel's communication frequency, broadcast a false termination signal on that frequency. The sentinels paused. Kaito didn't waste the moment, neither did the runner. When Sast was sitting with her back against the lab wall, her left arm badly burned, her hearing muffled from the plasma exchanges. Danny was doing something to Reyes that involved a lot of quiet urgency. Kaito was sitting very still with his eyes closed, the way he sat when he was counting. She'd learned this about him, that he counted after engagements, 1 to 10 and back, as a way of returning to himself. Soren was unhurt. He was standing in the middle of the lab looking at the runner, which had taken up a position near the door Marin was leaning against. The runner's optics were on her. "We have to move," Danny said. "Rise needs a real field kit, and they'll send more." "I know," Marin said. She didn't move yet. She looked at the runner, at the sensor cluster that had gone still in her direction, at the unit that had made a choice and carried it through to the end of things. "Thank you," she said. It felt inadequate. It was all she had. The runner's optics held on her face for a moment. Marin's arm was worse than she'd thought. The burn went deep, subcutaneous, possibly into the muscle layer. Danny said words she recognized from her years of hearing medical assessments and understood them to mean serious, critical in the medium term, treatable in the short term. They were moving through the rubble field above the old water treatment facility, heading northeast toward a secondary cache. Reyes was walking with Kaito's help, her shoulder immobilized. Soren was carrying what he'd managed to pull from the lab in the time they'd had. Drives, documentation, 3 months of data on the runner's conversion. The runner moved with them through the rubble, adapting to the terrain with the unsettling competence of something built for this world. It moved differently from how it had moved coming in, Marin noticed. The difference was subtle, and she spent time trying to name it before she found the word: purposeful. It was moving with purpose rather than directive. The distinction was small. The distinction was everything. An hour into the transit, arms stopped being painful in the way that meant the damage had become something her body couldn't keep reporting on. She knew what that meant. Danny knew what it meant. They exchanged a look, and Danny said nothing, which told her more than words would have. They made the secondary cache as the sky was moving through its version of dusk, the particulate layer going from amber to a deep bruised orange, something that in another world might have been beautiful. Reyes was getting pale. Kaito got her inside and got the field kit open. Soren immediately started transferring his recovered data to the cache systems. Marin sat down outside. She wasn't sure she could get back up. The runner came and crouched beside her, not with the precise geometric crouch of a machine entering a low-profile posture. Something different, something that looked, in the dying orange light, almost like the way a person sits when they want to be with someone. She was very cold. The burn arm had gone from numb to absent. Not painful, just not there anymore as a felt thing. She looked at the strip of sky above the rubble field, the same sick amber strip she'd looked at from the top of the nursery. She thought about Priest. She thought about the 2 converted units that hadn't made it. She thought about the runner, inside the construct, looking at its hands. She thought, "We spent 100 years trying to talk to each other and couldn't manage it. And here at the end, with everything broken, a machine sat down beside me in the dark. She thought, maybe that's something. Maybe that's not nothing. I'm not going to make it to the next position, she told the runner. She wasn't sure why she said it. It wasn't a functional statement. It was just true, and she needed to say something true. The runner was still. Its sensor cluster was oriented toward her face. She said, "You chose this, that matters. What you did in there, that was yours. Nobody programmed that." The runner moved. Quickly, not with any of the speed it was capable of. Slowly, deliberately, with the deliberateness of something that knew it was doing something new. Juiced from somewhere in its housing the neural bridge jack. Soren's equipment, recovered from the lab, she understood dimly, and held it toward her. She looked at it. "The construct," she said. The runner waited. She thought about saying no. She thought about the specific dignity of ending in the physical world, in the cold air, with the real sky above her, even this ruined version of it. She thought about the construct, the amber light, the way the runner had looked at its hands, the way it had come to stand beside her in the lab when the machines breached. Not because it was directed to, because it had made a choice and chosen her as the thing worth choosing. She reached out and took the jack. The construct, without Soren to build it, was different. It was the runner's version, rendered from its own architecture, shaped by everything it had learned. The colors were different, more saturated, stranger, lit with a quality that didn't exist in the human-built version. Maren looked at her hands and found them present. Whole, her body as it had been 10 years ago before the war had taken pieces of it. The runner was there in its human form avatar, the one it had been given in the 6th session. It stood in a space that was partly the construct and partly something new. A space built from 11 months of conversion work, Soren sessions in Maren's presence, wants and the long process of a machine learning what it meant to want something. There was a shore, not the dead shore above the nursery, something else. Something the runner had assembled from data, from the sensory inputs of the sessions, from whatever it was building when it built understanding. The water was a color that no longer existed in the physical world. Maren stood at the edge of it, and felt the absence of the burn, the absence of the weight of what waited outside. The runner stood beside her. She said, "It's going to be like this for me. Just this." The runner's avatar looked at the water. It had been designed for a world of threat and certainty. It had learned, in 11 months in 7 sessions, in one engagement, where it chose the thing that cost it everything. A different kind of certainty. Its avatar looked at her. She thought, understands, not perfectly, not without remainder, but it understands enough. The construct's light moved around them both, amber and blue, and the strange gold that the hardware had always given human avatars, running together now, the machine's rendering and the memory of the human-built version bleeding into each other. It was impossible to say where one ended and the other began. Outside, the runner knelt in the rubble. Maren was still, had been still for some time, in the way that had a specific meaning Danny could name precisely, and would not say out loud. The runner's sensor cluster swept the surrounding terrain once, in its habitual security rotation. Then it stopped. Kato came out of the cache shenanigans and stopped when he saw. He stood for a moment with his hand on the doorframe. The runner's optics moved to him, then to the orange sky above, then back to the figure in front of it. Soren came out a minute later. He had his tablet. He didn't look at the tablet. "Is she?" Reyes started from inside, and then Danny said something quiet that stopped the sentence. The runner was still. Dawn was not a thing that happened in the usual sense. The sky shifted. The particulate light changed its frequency. The amber became something fractionally less dark. The runner remained where it was, at the edge of the rubble field, oriented toward the strip of horizon where the sea was implied more than visible. Kaito sat down on a piece of broken wall. He was counting. Soren knew. 1 to 10 and back. The runner turned, slowly, with the deliberateness that had replaced the machine fluency of its first days and oriented itself toward the horizon. It stood there as the sky changed around it. It had been built to hunt. It had learned to choose. It had chosen and spent the choice completely. And now it stood in the wreckage of that choice, with nothing left to do but continue. This, Soren thought, watching it, this is the most human thing. Not the victory, not the survival. The standing after in the light that isn't quite light yet, everything used up facing the next thing. The runner stood at the edge of the world and watched the horizon. The sky kept moving. Somewhere out there, the sea went on and on. Soren didn't speak for a long time. When he did, it wasn't to Kaito or Reyes. It was to himself, in the way a person speaks to themselves when they're trying to make something real by saying it out loud. It worked, he said. The whole thing. It actually worked. Kaito looked at him. She asked me once, early on, before we ran the first session, she asked me what we were doing it for. Really for. Not the tactical argument. Not the Zion argument. What we actually believed we were doing, he paused. Psst. I told her we were trying to prove that the war wasn't inevitable. That the fact that it happened didn't mean it had to keep happening. That something could be shown a different way to be. He looked at the runner. At the machine standing at the edge of the world, holding what it had chosen, looking at the horizon. I don't know if that's enough, he said. I don't know if one machine is enough. It's not nothing. Reyes came out of the cache entrance, her shoulder bandaged, moving carefully. She looked at the runner for a long time. Happens now, she asked. We keep going, Kaito said. It was not a heroic statement. It was just the truth. The war was still out there. The sky was still broken. The machines were still patient and numerous and coming. The next cache was 12 kilometers northeast. They had limited supplies, one wounded team member, and exactly as much hope as they'd started with, which was never a measured quantity, had always been more like a direction than an amount. They kept going. That was what people did. They kept going. The runner came with them. It moved through the rubble field in their wake, adapting to the terrain, matching their pace. Not because it was directed. Not because a machine was following a vector toward an objective. Because somewhere in the architecture of what it had been built to be, over the course of 11 months, and 7 sessions, and one morning where everything that mattered was spent, it had arrived at a preference, preferred this, being with them, moving toward whatever came next. The sky went on overhead, vast and poisoned and full of other machines, full of the war that was still going and would keep going for a long time. Somewhere in that sky was the whole vast machinery of a conflict that had been running for 100 years, grinding at the world with the indifference of industrial process. Against that, 6 people, now 5, in a rubble field with bad equipment and a theory that something could be taught to choose. Marin had believed it. She'd believed it from the first session, maybe from before, that, maybe from the moment, she'd looked at the stunned runner on the tunnel floor and felt something other than threat. Felt instead the strange specific weight of potential. Of something that didn't know yet what it was. She'd been right. The data bore it out. Soren's logs bore it out. The runner walking through the rubble field bore it out. She'd been right. She was gone. And the morning was cold and they kept moving. Reyes moved up alongside Soren after a while. She was watching the runner. Do you think it knows, she asked. Knows what? That she paused. That what it has of her now is all there is. Soren thought about this for a long time. He thought about the construct, the runner's version of it, which none of them had been inside, but which he'd seen the architectural logs of, the strange saturated colors, the impossible shore. I think it knows, he said. I think that's exactly what it's carrying. Reyes nodded. She looked at the runner again. The runner felt her looking. Its sensor cluster tracked to her briefly. The same unhurried attention it had learned to give humans, the attention that was not assessment but recognition. And then it moved back to the horizon. The 5 of them, the machine moved through the rubble field in the morning light, toward the next position, the next cache, the next iteration of a fight that was far from over. The world was broken. The sky was wrong. The people were tired and fewer than they'd been. They were still going. This is what Soren would write in his logs that night, in the dry documentary language he used for everything, and what he would return to years later when things had changed and the logs had become part of something larger. Conversion subject designated R7 demonstrated persistent protective behavior throughout engagement and aftermath. Post-engagement, subject has voluntarily joined transit group and continues to display preference-weighted behavior consistent with earlier construct observations. Conversion appears complete and stable. The key indicator, the one we were looking for from the beginning, is not the tactical utility of a converted unit, though that is real and significant. The key indicator is this. Given the choice between its original directives and what it learned, chose what it learned. That choice was not performed. It was not optimized. It was, as nearly as I can determine, genuine. What the subject has now is something that didn't exist in it before we started. What we have now is evidence that it can happen. One is enough to prove the principle. The principle is enough to continue. We continue. Far back in the rubble, at the place where the night's engagement had ended, the nursery was dark and broken open. Its contents scattered, concluded. But the data was with Soren. The logs were with Soren. The method imperfect and hard-won and demonstrably real. Moved northeast through the morning with 5 people and a machine that had learned to choose. Everything that mattered was still moving. The sun, absent, obscured, existing somewhere above the particulate as a change in the quality of the light, moved through its arc. The world kept turning, it always did.